Hello once again, this is Tony Wright, First Love Christian Church, FLCC, and A.B. Wright Ministries. This is the 90-day Bible study. We're doing day 2930, and we're in First Chronicles. We'll be going from chapter 1, verse 1, all the way through 23:32. We are, because of the material that we're covering right now, covering 2 days summary in this clip. So don't forget and be looking for a separate 29 and 30. This is both. Okay, so let's see. Where do we start? Well, first of all, please stop rolling your eyes around like you're having some kind of conniption. Listen, I bet you've been asking yourself, why are you reading all these genealogies and all these things that it seems like you just finished reading? I'm glad you asked. Well, a key thing to keep in mind is this. That although you just read yesterday where Judah was taken into captivity, and now both Judah and Israel in captivity, the writing in this book is taking place more than 100 years after what you read yesterday took place. What? Yep. Judah was in captivity for 70 years, and they've been returning to Jerusalem. And over the past 75 years or so, it's been pretty tough. There's no temple. The only land that they had available to the returning Jews is a strip of land that's about a 15-mile radius around Jerusalem. The walls of the city are in ruin. The surrounding neighbors are certainly not warm and friendly people to them, The crops are poor and non-existent. The people have gone through famines. Morale is low. There's very little, if anything, to motivate the people spiritually or otherwise for that matter. So the writer of this book, and we often just, call this person the chronicler, needs to remind these people of their national identity. This is God's chosen people. Sometimes we do forget who we are and whose we are. Boy, remind me. These people were somebody even before they were a divided nation, represented by two kingdoms, one northern, one southern. Okay, they were somebody even before Moses went into Egypt to bring them into a homeland. They were somebody when God passed his law onto them in the wilderness. And spending 70 years in exile did not change that. They are still somebody. They're still God's people. And this writer has to find a way to help them remember that, to restore their confidence, their joy, and their spirit. Boy, I hope they're feeling better, because I know I do. Woo-wee. They need to restore, their temple worship. Sometimes you just need to get back to church, You know what I'm saying? Boy, help me. And in the meantime, this chronicler, though, he wants to help encourage a change in their self-image and in their confidence of knowing their identity as God's chosen people. So as we enter into this book of Chronicles, we're looking at the generations of God's chosen people from Adam down through Abraham. And for the writer, this is important because it shows a kinship between Israel and the surrounding tribes. And some of the genealogies listed establish some legitimacy of rank and of authority for some of the various individuals that come into play. And as you read through them, you get a sense of a theological history and a movement along this line that by all humankind is moving toward a point that's been established by our Creator. And then this list helps make a connection to Israel as being one, as opposed to the two nations that we were left remembering when they went into captivity. It places a connection between the two factions by their genealogy. And regardless of how they got to where they were prior to exile, right, it makes that connection. So as you read through these first chapters, you saw the descendants of those individuals that you read in earlier books that we covered. Now, surely there were many of those names that were familiar. And then for the Arab side of the family, you likely saw names that you could more likely map to a place rather than to a person. That would make sense, right? Because for both Ishmael and Esau, we didn't really delve that much into as much detail on who their descendants were as you did for where they went, right? And although there in the first chapter, we see again the kings of Edom that were kings who descended from the Ishmael-Esau sides of the family. Now, did you notice as you read through Judah's descendants that the names in his lineage trace down through David? Well, of course, you probably need to keep your eyes on that one. And the chronicler all but ignored the northern kingdom, but he placed most of his emphasis on Judah. And as you saw in that Davidic line of kings, Miss Athaliah, Miss let's kill all the sons so I can sit on the throne, is of course not in that lineage listed there. Oh my goodness. Then we see the tribes and the families of those tribes relative to where they existed during various reigns of the kings. So when other nations came to war against Israel, it was most often one or more of these tribes involved in those battles. Though much of the actions that we've looked at have centered around areas where the Levites were, it was centered on them because of their proximity to the temple and to the worship tent and to the altar. So the discussion about their duties and their responsibilities during the reign of different kings draws some interesting highlights as well, right? Now, there's also, though, considerable information about who settled where, back in Jerusalem and around after they were freed from captivity. For the leaders, for the priests, for the temple guards, for the Levites, and for others. And the chronicler also recounts how Saul was defeated and how the Philistines disrespected the body of he and his sons, and then how the men of Jabesh Gilead went out and recovered those bodies. And the chronicler also recounts about how David was anointed king. And man, anybody would be hard pressed to even try to put together a list of such valiant men of battle as David had. Boy, and at the rate that they had to go into battle, are you kidding me? It was on all the time for these dudes. Here in these chapters, though, we see, which fighters came from which tribes during those battles, like the battles at Ziklag and at Hebron, and what actually occurred in preparing for and moving the ark. These chapters go through all of that here in the Chronicles. And the amount of detail here is much greater than that in Samuel and Kings, right? For the individual and the family contributions to those efforts. Now, whether you're talking about battle or building, it's more detailed. And we're told here as well of David's heart to build a temple, but God commissioned Solomon to do so instead. But David did indeed put down the threats of both the Philistines and the Moabites. And Israel also defeated the Syrians and the Ammonites. But when David gave the order to Joab to go out and count the people of Israel and Judah, it angered God. And he sent pestilence in the land and killed 70,000 people before he repented and stayed the hand of the angel. Then David, remember, he called Solomon, told him of his desire to build a house for the Lord, but that God had told him that he had shed much blood and fought many wars, and he would not build that house, but that his son, and in this case Solomon, would build that house. And David charged Solomon to follow in God's ways, to keep the law of the Lord, and that if he does, then his ways would be prosperous. Then David charged all the princes of Israel to help and support Solomon. And Solomon was appointed to be king. And David gathered all the princes and the priests and the Levites together. And he began to prepare them for what they would do with regard to building and running of the temple, right? And all this stuff, the writer is penning for his people to move them in a certain direction, to gird up and encourage themselves and prepare to rebuild. All this is putting things in order, to take the people somewhere. And it starts with realizing just who they are. Buddy, they didn't have this. Like I said, we just read yesterday about them going into exile. And we saw all that was happening when we read this stuff. And we know what did happen. And we know what will happen. And we saw that they were still in the dark, just trying to figure out and find their way. And this chronicler was trying to write down something that might help them in finding their way. For us, we have it all. We know, we know the whole story. And we're in it. Boy, if we can't stand tall, like we know, I don't know about you, but I've checked my genealogy and I'm in that Davidic line. Boy, let me stop. But don't you stop. You keep reading this word and you keep checking us out on your favorite social media platform and keep passing this on to someone that you know needs the word. And don't forget, tell your friends, tell your neighbors. FLCC, we're on the move, brothers and sisters. We're taking ministry back to the first love. All God's people said, peace.